Good morning and welcome to this edition of Focus on Parliament on Civic Space TV. Today, the 4th of November 2023, I am Phillip Muliisa. Just this week, the Minister of Energy in Uganda, the Honorable Ruth Nankabirwa, tabled a bill before Parliament for first reading. And key to note in this bill is that government is looking to mandate or given a monopoly to Uganda National Oil Company to be the sole importer of oil products, petroleum products in this country. What do you think about that? Is it easier to have the government take charge of the oil market and the oil industry in this country, or it is better we keep it a private entity? To discuss that and make an understanding of it is a panel of distinguished ladies and gentlemen who are very well versed with this subject. We'll introduce them in a bit, but before I introduce them, remember, this is made possible by the Center for Constitutional Governance, and we want to appreciate them for the work they do. Introducing my guests today from my extreme left is Madam Charity Ahimbisibwe. She's the Executive Director. Am I representing?
Yeah, you're right. Electoral Laws and Governance.
She's the Executive Director, Electoral Laws and Governance in this country. Madam, you most welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And on the middle seat is the Honorable Joseph Ochieno, UPC diehard, soon entering Uganda House. Should we be optimistic, Mr. Joseph?
Hopefully.
Welcome.
It will be fantastic. It will be fantastic news for this country. Yes, thank you.
And let's dive into the topic. We are getting out our oil from the ground in the year 2025, according to government. And a few months to what we anticipate as Ugandans to be what will drive this economy for the next maybe half a century or centuries to go. Government comes up with something to own the oil market. And I want to start with you, Madam Charity. The bill says they are helping Ugandans to manage scarcity, manage price, but also kind of regulate the oil companies that operate in this market. But before we get to that, help us understand the aspects of the bill, how it is affecting the oil, how it is going to work, and maybe how it affects the oil deal that is coming in 2025.
Okay, so of course, looking at the bill and the way it is crafted in Parliament, you cannot judge exactly what it's going to do because the wording is clear. Government is saying we have had middlemen in importing oil products. And what we want now is to be in charge of managing the oil products, importation, and the value chain, the people who supply and manage oil around Uganda, or the companies that manage oil around Uganda. And they've said we've had unfair trade happening at regional level, because what happened in the past is that East Africa came together and started to lobby on how to get oil products from the international community. But the country that was leading on that process was Kenya. And of course, Kenya had to look out for its interest all the time. And so when Uganda went to buy products from Kenya, there are times when they were being told, we are not going to supply you the percentage that you're looking at. If Uganda went for probably 60% of the oil they wanted, or other products like gas that they wanted from there, they would say, no, we only have 40% for you, for Somalia, yourself, Congo, and the other countries that had come together, and even Tanzania, Burundi, yeah. So in terms of balance of trade, it looked a bit unfair. But I'll be talking about the politics behind that, because we saw the president having a conversation with the team in Nairobi, but that comes in at a time when we had upsets within our milk supply to Kenya and other products that we'd been exporting there. and we can't export them anymore, are we also feeling like, if you can't accept some of our products, we must also edge you out at another point, because we have oil anyway and we're going to produce it in 2025. Now, the minister said in the bill that she presented on the floor of Parliament, one, they want to improve supply for the local consumer, because during the time of COVID, we saw the prices of fuel going up and it was difficult for government to intervene because it was market forces. But now, if they are sole suppliers, then it becomes easy for them to intervene. But I will explain to you a bit later that we have reservoirs in ginger which are oftentimes empty. And I don't think that that is a result of the middleman who government is trying to get rid of. Yes, I have heard, and it sounds good on paper. Like I have told you, the bill, when you read it, it's very good, because the bill is supposed to protect me as an ordinary Ugandan consuming the products from a Ugandan company. And it is supposed to make the Ugandan company compete favorably on the international market. Because once we produce oil and we have oil products coming out of Uganda, we will need to sell them to some people. And they want to use the Uganda National Oil Company to be the company that will sell those products internationally, now that you will have a direct linkage with an international company. In the previous arrangement of East African region, we could not directly go to the international traders. We had to go through the arrangement of East Africa. Now, with the new bill that was being suggested in Parliament, the Uganda National Oil Company can directly go to the international traders, which makes it easier. If you look on the face of it, everything is perfect. But our country has its imperfections, which I will speak to, one being corruption.
Thank you so much, Madam Charity, for that overview of the bill that was presented on Tuesday. Mr. Joseph, it's an interesting bill. Don't you think it's a deal worth it for this country?
Corruption makes anything and everything extremely difficult to be enjoyed by an average citizen of any country. In fact, corruption is such a corrosive disease that even in established democracies, where they rear their ugly heads, they impact hugely in communities and, in this case, trades and whatever services are involved. It's interesting what Charity is saying about the East Africa arrangement. I wasn't actually particularly sure about that, and that sort of surprises me.
It is true.
Because, as it were, I have argued, and we've argued, particularly from a UBC perspective, generally as a broader policy thing, and something that we'll come back to, that clearly the old East African community that the European Union bought from, that was founded by our then founding parents, was a community that functioned. This is even the corruption element. It functioned. It had leadership, it had systems, it had regulation, it had legislation, and it worked. I do not know at any particular time that, perhaps in the 60s or possibly even early 70s before the break of the community, but particularly in the 60s, towards the later end of the 60s when the community was really fairly ripe, that would have any...
Mr. Joseph, you seem to suggest the East African community is non-functional currently, and perhaps this is showing how much it is going down.
I am giving a contextual background to this, because that's an important point, because it is going to help us disclaim most of the arguments being made. Because actually, if it were, it shouldn't really be a problem. So I'm simply saying that at the time, I don't see how the ticketing services for East African Railways would be a problem in Tanzania, where the headquarters, East African Railways was in Nairobi, simply because maybe Kenyan leaders are wanting to play politics. So there's something missing still about this. But fast forward, I am a socialist and I'm a social democrat. And so I am a fundamental believer in big government. And we've actually argued, therefore, that when it comes to projects like this, they should actually have an element of strong state monopoly. So in a way, as Charity says, this is one of those few things that would very substantially welcome that the state really takes lead on. And normally, actually, even in established democracies, perhaps even in America, which is substantially private sector led, the state has got very strong regulatory arm and to be able to create an enabling environment for these private sector players to play. So it really technically, and that's why I don't know about the bill, it should not necessarily mean that because the state leads in importation and export of these, that the smaller players, in this case like Shell, Tinder, or Total, or Renew Oil, or a Charity Oil Limited, Hoima, does not, have to come in and play and take their share. It's basically at the global center, and you correct me on that. But so if that's the case, it should be okay and should be a welcome move. In fact, during COVID, I argued, and we argued severally, I think including some of these programs. In fact, I even wrote an opinion piece challenging this regime for their failure to intervene on cushioning on the prices. But I must say that actually, that was not necessarily because they did not have the monopoly, meaning even if they had this legislation, the argument they were trying to make was that no, they are making people get spoiled. Even other nations that basically have open market systems, they intervene because they basically intervene through taxation and you intervene through subsidies, really. So you can by and large still do about the same thing. But that said, why the anomaly comes up today in 2023 from 2003, when these guys were settling this, who then was doing that and who would not have been seeing this, I don't know. That's why I think now it's slightly much more about politics. And finally, if it's possibly not about politics and ownership, and my concern that who then would be this person, those privileged person, not the old company or the person. I hope that person is not a real person and person linked to corruption. But in the event that it is actually the oil company, I mean the Uganda National Oil Company, one, I would be very, very delighted. And I hope that, therefore, whatever the outcome of this is really long-term in the best interest of Uganda. But I think that in any case, anyway, it's preparing Uganda for the next journey, phase of us owning oil and beginning to play, boasting in 2026, 2027.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. And you mentioned us owning oil, but according to the agreement with Total and Sinop, we know that Uganda owns only 5% of
oil. There you go.
Maybe that's something we shall discuss. But Madam Charity, the East African community, you mentioned it earlier and how it was involved in and how Kenya was trying to curtail how much we get and how much Rwanda gets. How do we and when do we as East African stockers want to make sure we get something for us, not individually? He mentioned the East African Railway Corporation.
You see, it is unfortunate, like he's saying, that the East African presidents have failed to gel or they have failed to cede power to each other to do significant development for the countries as East Africa. Except we have now seen Ruto and the president of Rwanda, Kagame, taking away visa requirements to allow people to freely move across East Africa, saying, if you do not allow for movement to happen, then trade can't take place. And then a lot of things can't happen freely. In a free market, there should be quick movement for people, not hustling at airports to get these visas. But the point I don't want us to lose is that from the bill that was tabled before Parliament, the Uganda National Oil Company is a company. Now, a company is an artificial personality who can be sued and they can also sue. So they have legal rights and responsibilities. Now, for you to have those legal rights and responsibilities, the law had to buffer the Uganda National Oil Company. Before now, there was a gap in the sections that she refers to, section 3, she refers, I think, to section 5, and in the schedules, the first and third schedule, she refers to them and says the gap was Uganda National Oil Company was not like a monopoly. It was not the sole supplier of oil products in Uganda. And you've seen the market has become very dynamic. You've seen different companies coming here and making a fortune from us. But UNOC taking over is no guarantee that that pump price will come down. It's also no guarantee that Ugandans are assured it's going to be better. In fact, when there was competition, the cutthroat competition and wherever these people got their oil from, because there are some companies which would buy oil at a cheaper rate, and so their pump price was a bit cheaper. And then you would go to Shell and find the pump price is at 5.8 or 5.9, and you go to another station and you find it at 5,200, or sometimes you find it at 5,100. Now, when government comes in and says, we will be managing that pump price, notice they have seen how the money is moving around there, and they see how the trade is working out. And one of the things that the Uganda National Oil Company is looking to do is to make money. Okay? It's one of the agendas amongst the things that the bill is coming to cure. She said, 1, the prices; 2, buffer Ugandans during times of crisis; 3, make money for the company to be able to build infrastructure to support.
And then 4, allegedly stock.
Support the infrastructure for oil that is going to be extracted in 2025. But back to the East African question, which is a beautiful question that you put across. So what has been happening in the East African region is that every government looks out for its interests. So Kenya, in terms of oil, because they have the port in Mombasa, and because they can access the international traders, like now we have signed the deal with Swissport, the Bahrain company, and it's a Dutch-Swiss company. So it has an arm in Switzerland, it is in Dutch, in the Dutch and Netherlands.
And maybe on that exactly,
yes.
the Dutch, the Vito company, that one. You are saying Uganda National Oil Company, but again, there is a company that are in to undertake the events on behalf of UNOC. Who is in charge?
Exactly. So in company law, there is something interesting. And I like this question because I think the journalists need now to dig. In company law, there is what we call lifting the veil. Why don't we lift a bit of the veil to know who is behind this company? Who is behind the Swiss company? Who has shares? Who is the shareholder? Who are the promoters? Who are the believers in this company? I don't know, but I see the official body of a company called Swiss Port or Swiss Dutch company from Bahrain, EC. I see a name there. So there is a company. But for a company to be set up, of course, a public company. In Uganda, we have our standard. Across the board, international standards apply for international companies. And this is an international company. So, of course, it applies for international company. However, since we're in a partnership, UNOC and the international company, then we are ruled by 2 kinds of laws. One, our Companies Act, but we are also governed by the international law. So international law, of course, information of companies and treaties and understanding between countries, you should just comply by what the standards, international standards have been set in terms of trading in that particular product. And this one being oil. In terms of our local Ugandan company, the Company Act requires that the minimum number of people who form a company, a public company like the one that was established, the Uganda National Oil Company, is 7. Maximum is infinity. So until we know who are the 7, who are the promoters, the questions then still lie out there. But there are people who start companies, and that Swiss company, we should also find out who is behind it. You might find some of the people in UNOC are also promoters in the other company, or they are partners in the other company. I can't know it for a fact until when we lift the veil. But usually lifting the veil is also done under particular circumstances. If they suspect fraud, if it is inconsistent with the statute, and it's not yet inconsistent with the statutes as they are. So legally, you can't lift that veil until certain issues have emerged. As it is, a company remains on its own as an artificial person with its obligations. Now, just that I don't lose the East African argument. So Kenya has companies like we see Starbucks, like we see Rubis, You've seen these companies here?
Yes, yes.
Those are Kenyan companies.
And those are trying to avoid, I was trying to avoid to mention their names. Just. But anyway, carry on.
No, you see, you can't avoid mentioning
You
these
know,
things.
anyway, but
And because they're a fact,
That's right.
we live with them. So I don't know how we can try to be very subtle about it. Of course, Shell is also not a
And I was
Ugandan
saying-
company.
and I was saying it, but
Even
for- yeah.
Total Energies is not a Ugandan company. Tell me which Ugandan company is trading in Ugandan oil. It may be Beyonce
was actually-
Traders.
City Oil.
and the reason I was saying that,
City Oil also has tendencies of shareholders who are not necessarily Ugandan, are they?
Charity, you know, I was actually holding that back deliberately. And I was going to, part of the conversation we're going to have much later. But if in any case, anyway, which of these are actually Ugandan indigenous businesses?
So
you know?
Joseph, let me
But
conclude
you
on
see-
just that part.
Yeah, sure.
So what happened is Kenya had its own companies that were trading in the oil products. And they were looking to maximize profits from those oil products. So they didn't care about the agreement that they're the ones who are lobbying for East Africa. They cared more for their national interests than the East African interests. So Uganda, seeing that they were being edged out, then the president moved in to say, I think we're getting something not right, which I think is okay in terms of the law and in terms of making sure that Uganda also competes favorably on the international. You imagine if we had to give East Africa to manage the oil that is going to be extracted in Uganda. It would have been a good deal if we had a way of balancing our interests as a region. But we have failed to balance those interests. And the more we fail to balance those interests, then the more we get problems like the one we are getting, because we will now get more and more legislation for every East African country becoming sole suppliers for particular products, other than remaining open to trade for where you're stronger.
Thank you. Mr. Joseph, you politicians are in charge of everything. You want to mess with our oil. Talk to us. When you get a law that regulates what we think we as Ugandans is going to manage our economy, is going to boost our economy, should we trust politicians on this?
You're absolutely right that to challenge politicians. But unfortunately, you guys don't have politicians. You're very unlucky. You're never born with politicians. You've been born in a country
What do we
that
have?
is ruled by people in politics. The last politicians were forced out by force in July 1985. Have I answered you? So there are no politicians ruling this country. You know, when politicians govern, some of these issues would not have arisen. And I say, make a very serious point about it. I'm still actually quite shocked, because even if it were the case actually that some of these challenges are applying, I would expect something as big as oil, as big as petroleum products, and to have had a national regulatory framework, and that would have actually catered for one, a national interest, two, the interest of the smaller petroleum industries and companies in Uganda, and then three, the broader national strategic import of what petroleum is all about. So even that was not there, because like Charles was saying, we had this big thing in Ginger, you know, last built by Idi Amin, and it was again a part of the conversation around COVID, and that we don't know the last time it was ever filled to a quarter. So it's basically bad politics for which we have this. Interestingly, to the extent that this is 2023, and we are talking retreating to our domestic legislations when it comes to things as big as this, when these things have got big environmental implications. Petroleum products is possibly amongst the most expensive thing, where our exchequer money gets disappearing. That there is no harmonized position by Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, countries that pollute our streets like Rwanda, Congo, in terms of fuming the spaces, and Tanzania. It tells you, you're absolutely right, how bad politics it is, meaning absence of political leadership. If we had genuine, decent polity at play. As I said, a UPC government would be considering the environmental implications. The UPC government or a decent political party, regardless in government, in politicians, would be considering tax implications. The UPC, a sensible politician should be thinking about the rebates. Sensible politicians should be thinking about how best, how when they see the trends in the markets go. And indeed, sensible nation states with decent polity. Charity referred to it as extremely important when he challenged you journalists. Do you know that this is such a big thing now, come to think of it, that we should not actually be discussing this on Focus on Parliament almost as a mere by the way. Possibly not only should we have a legislator here, but the big political parties, I always see this, big political parties should be challenged formally on their views and opinions of this. These are matters that before a bill is tabled in Parliament, we should be having already big national debate. And to the extent that even if it went to Parliament, I actually don't know what NUP's position is in this in terms of response, regardless of their numbers. I don't know what DP's position is. I don't know what ANT's position is. The ANT do they have a member of Parliament? Regardless,
They don't have a member.
but they'd be an eminent national political organization, and definitely my Uganda People's Congress as a political party. Secondly, as being proposed, I would expect the big national media to be giving not only profile to this, but actually having a considered bit, meaning you guys in the media, the economics correspondents and economics editors doing, working with investigative journalists to bring up these questions and put the state to task, put the ministers to task, and to the question, this national oil company thing, who are actually board members, who are actually going to be leading in this company. Those are all the legitimate questions that should be had. I'm actually helping your question in a very rounded way to make this thing relevant.
Just on that particular point, you talk about journalists, and I'll give an example. The agreement between UNOC and Total about the oil in the Albertine region and the pipeline, that agreement has not been put to the public to date. And we had journalists going to court. Charles Mwangusha went to court. And until
you read the latest on that, actually. It's interesting.
Yes, and until now, government has said
not released
that agreement cannot be put to public. So you cannot blame journalists.
I'm not blaming. I'm actually saying it should be a matter of subject of conversation and much more detail. And thank you, really, Civic Space, for having this conversation. And actually, maybe that qualifies more of the point Chet and I are making, that actually maybe this debate should return and make actually much more relevant Mangusha's submission, and to put government to task, put them on the defensive. And these really are the things that particularly younger people like yourselves should be mobilizing and organizing to go and have a demonstration in the streets of Kampala. Okay, call them even merely pickets. I genuinely, honestly say this, that maybe this is one of the few things that young people ought to be able to go and demand for, and they should do so through picketing, either going to Kololo Airstrip or going to City Center or actually going to picket Parliament and say, put a demand
young people are interested in a regulated oil price.
Oh, no, that's true. But I'm saying, yes, but under what circumstances? This is part of the question we've been asked. What is the guarantee? It's absolutely common sense. They're interested in it. The more reason why they should make sure that there's a guarantee that the regulatory process is not going to involve corruption. They're not going to be shoddy individuals. And above all, they should get much more of the details to link up with the Charles Mwangusha case to mean therefore that, well, come 2025 and going forward, the oil belongs to Ugandans and oil is not played around with. And beyond that, some of the wider things, including environmental issues, are actually discussed as part of this conversation.
Yes, thank you. Madam Charity, our oil is coming out in 2025, and every time there is a conversation about oil anywhere, people think about Hoima, people think about Lake Albert, people think about the pipeline. Does this bill affect the oil that is going to come out in 2025?
Most certainly. I think that this bill was meant to organize,
to preempt, yes,
for that oil that is coming in 2025. If you see what the minister said, that the company that is investing, the Swiss-Dutch company, it's going to construct infrastructure for storage of some of the products that come out of oil to a tune of 30 million liters That was for fuel in Mpigi. She even names the place in Mpigi. And she says, this is a different facility from the one that was in Jinja. And she says, with that number of liters, we can be able to buffer the country in terms of a crisis. If there is a war, for example, in Ukraine, there is a war in Gaza, or like the time Russia was affected, and Russia was one of the biggest traders in oil. That's what caused the COVID shift in the prices.
You see, Madam Charity, a Ugandan will ask, during the COVID crisis, there is a company to whom Captain Mike Mukula is one of the directors. It was given some money and it is setting up facilities still around the MPG area for the same purpose. Why is government doing almost similar things in a sequence to cater for the same challenge?
So the bill talks about UNOC working alongside all other companies that work within the sector of oil. But for it will take a lead. So UNOC, the Uganda National Oil Company, will take a lead in managing all these other smaller companies. So whether Mike Mukula has a company or any other company comes on board, it doesn't matter. They still need these companies to work along with them. UNOC cannot work alone. It cannot be a monopoly for everything. It has to have people that support it. But I think the bigger question would be, Uganda started to construct Simba Dam, and they also constructed, I think, another 2 or 3 dams, which are Karuma. And, now, the time when the government came out to say we have constructed these dams, they said, look here, Ugandans, we are going to produce more electricity for you. There will be less load shedding, and even the prices of electricity are going to come down. But is it true that our electric prices have come down per unit for which we pay Umeme? No. They got in partnership with Umeme, which was a South African company, gave it a chance to run and sell units to local Ugandans. And we continue to pay very high prices for electricity, which had increased in production. So looking at the way Umeme was handled, I don't really think, in fact, I don't even want to say, do you really think? I don't really think it will be any different with the oil. So they have a company they have come in partnership with, and one of the agenda is to make money. You might find that that agenda overtakes the other agendas that would have benefited the ordinary person, because why is it that that pump price, even with the legislation starting the way it is, even with the small crude oil that has been coming out of those areas of Muliisa, Hoima, and the places where people have the oil wells, how come it has not significantly helped our oil trade as a country? So I think there is...
If anything, actually, the prices have risen, are rising actually in the course of the last 1 week, and there's no explanation. And again, there's no major debate.
Yes, and my gut feeling is that when UNOC finally takes over entirely as the price is going to go even higher than that. It's going to go higher than 5,000. It might hit 7, even 10,000.
And they're going to begin to blame infrastructure.
It's my gut feeling. I don't know. It sounds good on paper, like I said. Everything is perfect on paper. When you look at the bill, when you look at the mission for the bill, when you look at once the plan is the grand plan to defend the country and its interests in oil, it looks good. But from what we have seen in the past, in terms of alliances, and when government promises us as citizens that we have produced this, so it's going to negate this, I don't see it. I also don't see the environmental issue emphasized. Even in the oil bill, you see them talking about the storage, the infrastructure, the construction, and the companies, how they will trade, and the terms, the relationship between UNOC and these companies that will be trading. The bill is clear about that. But the bill doesn't, I know we have the environment, a lot of laws on the environment and whatever, but it's good to have them synchronized by referencing them even in this bill.
In fact, considering the industry, considering the size, considering the magnitude, and considering this is actually one of the key national and normally global pollutants, It would have been prudent. Again, another common sense. I don't know who advises this minister. These guys just make loads of money for nothing. Actually, you're absolutely right. There should have been a specific clause embedded as part of the legislation, something to do with the environment. And then the other two, an emphasis on local content, and it's not there, those two. But anyway, I thought I would just say that.
Yeah. Local content, I think, has now been taken care of in the bill, but the infrastructure to support local content is missing. Because you see, even when the industries that were investing in oil came, like Terenga, like Total Energies, when they're going to set up a pipeline, certain things happen. They need local laborers, they need intellectuals who are going to write papers and think through the process. They need environmentalists who will be planting trees in other places to replace the carbon emissions that would have happened in the air. They need to check how many are going to go out, at what rate. Scientists will be running lab things and whatever. But we didn't have a whole developed industry along that chain of intellectual property. And so that remains a big gap. As much as, yes, you're becoming an independent organization going to take over, you are a company, but the gap is huge.
You mentioned local content, and the president over time has been everywhere saying, yes, we need local content, but it is rubbish to delay an investor just because it hasn't met local content requirements. And he says, provided the company is here, there is always time to involve Ugandans in this investment, in this, whether 10 or 20 years to come. Ugandans will be part of it. I don't know. What do you think about it?
That's the guy in politics for you. Mr. Museveni is not a politician. Mr. Museveni is a guy in politics who's used politics successfully. And as I said, this country has run in the last 40 years almost by accident. It's extraordinary, particularly for Museveni, who, when it's convenient, he takes a...
Mr. Joseph, 40 years by accident.
Yes. And we can have another conversation on that. And I must say so, therefore. So Mr. Museveni, who's come around with this left-leaning, leftist kind of stuff, isn't it a contradiction, really? That, you would be a leader, allegedly, with that background. Of course, we know he's not. When it comes to some of these things, Museveni one thing in the morning and something else in the afternoon, completely something different in the evening. So really, you cannot be a progressive left leader, own oil, which you even call your own, and then have that language that investors are more important for you. There is a tone and a message for investors. For a country
he has a point. He says, provided the company is put up here, then it contributes to the GDP of the country.
So it does not matter regardless? Stop scaring me as a young person. But no, look.
Melissa, maybe to give Joseph a bit of information. During COVID, there are two companies which have folded because they came and they were given land. They were going to produce medicine for COVID-19, and it didn't happen. One was in Luwero. It was closed. You know why that would happen? It's partly not organizing. But if I want to take myself off Uganda, sometimes I don't want to be stressed by the things that we see around. Let's look at Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the oil-producing countries for Africa. Even Ghana does have a lot of oil, and it's an oil-producing country. See, one of the things when you're a country and you discover you have oil, and you're going to develop local content, you look at those countries and what they have done, learn from them, and see the gaps that existed in their processes as they set up local content, so that in your own model, it is better than theirs, because they have suffered the oil curse up to now, that they have the oil, but they can't make a lot of profit from that oil. That is Ghana, that is Nigeria. And so as Uganda, one of the things that was written by Professor Kasuja, he wrote an academic paper where he said, this oil might turn out to be a curse. You can Google that paper by Professor Kasuja. He was warning on the whole question of local content and preparation for the first oil that is going to be produced and passing on information. If you look at the documents that the Ministry of Energy has concerning the organizing around this sector, you'll be very impressed. But how many Ugandans are actually engaging with that sector, the way the documents have been crafted, I can bet it's a decimal number. I have not done statistical research in that area, but at least I know that very small number of Ugandans are engaging in that area.
And to an extent that this morning I was actually with a young man from Hoima towards Masinda, and part of the conversation having this. This guy is riding a border in town. And I tease him about his oil city, saying, yes, Hoima per se is expanding. But when you go below the need for people like him, who is a young father, there is really hardly any major impact that you would say that, well, we are beginning to have hope that this thing is going to impact on our community. Now, surely this oil thing should not be something for the benefit of people in Hoima, bits of Masindi and Bulisa, and maybe just stop at Kagadi. This is the national thing. So meaning that even someone from Tororo should feel that we've got oil, and should feel that there's a new and emergent industry, and should feel that we are now an oil giant and there is hope, particularly from a young people's point of view. So if it's the case that actually even the locals are not seeing it and not feeling it, and I don't want to make it, to emphasize that point, because our good friend Stephen Muktali, who is a former member of parliament for Bulisa, part of his campaigns as an economist and as a local, he almost has a wholesale campaign on this very particular issue, on the absence of local content. And he himself, an NRM supporter, by the way, feels substantially disempowered. And so no, it's an important point. But of course, as you're raising it, by the way, of course, you're raising it as journalists also in a way to also put me in a bit of a devil's advocate. No, generally, on these matters like oil, and that's why I was deliberately talking environment, young people ought to be much more engaged in many of these things. And yes, indeed, what you're doing, journalists need to do a lot much more critiquing, and we need to be able to put the state slightly much more on the defensive. And for something like this, in part for what Charity has said, these things only happen once. In 20 years' time, we'll be looking back and simply say, why didn't we rise up and take a position? That's why I was challenging, in a nice way, that no, actually, some of these things, like part of the initiatives by the Charles Mangushas and others, the youth of this country need to be able to demand slightly much more from clarity from government, because at the end of the day, this is ours. So if we can't get this right, I'm not sure how many others we're going to be getting right in future.
Yes, thank you for that. And maybe as we get to the break, I want to ask Madam Charity, through COVID and even before and after COVID, we saw a couple of international companies leaving the Ugandan market. We saw ShopRite going out, we saw Orange going out. And we are coming out with a bill that might not sit well with companies like Shell, like Total. Do you see them accepting the terms of this bill?
Because it is new, I think government will have to have a lot of conversation with these big trading companies. Because the sad thing would be if they actually folded and went. Shell, Total Energies have key trade partners on the international scene, which Uganda taps into. But Total might not leave. Why? It is one of the key partners for Uganda on the oil production chain. In all the documents, if you go and pick all the documents at the Ministry of Energy, it will show you that Total is one of the partners. And it's also one of the key partners of the Uganda National Oil Company. When you're a partner, then you have interest in that company. You have part of your interest is to see that that company also goes forward, because when it progresses, you're also progressing. So Total Energies would not be threatened at all. What I would not be sure about is Shell, because Shell does not seem to appear on any of those documents. And we also saw a British company that folded up, Tullow Oil. It left, and that's the time Sinopec, the Chinese national oil company, took over in partnership with the Uganda National Oil Company. Now, that alone should not worry us. The foreign companies should not worry us. I think what should worry us more is when government makes a promise that the ordinary citizen is going to benefit from the new bill, and this is how we're going to do it. The minister explained how government is going to do it. it better deliver on its mandate than to leave the gaps that we always see every time they promise.
You see, Madam Charity, you say it should not worry us, but one of the drivers of the economy, according to government, is foreign investment. And we know how, when you say Total cannot leave, we know what happened in Russia. Many Russian companies had agreements with Total, with Mercedes, with very many American companies. And when Russia went into Ukraine, these companies left.
They left because of global politics and also because of the instability that had happened.
And there is a lot of politics on Uganda. You see how the America is squeezing us out of AGOA, out of World Bank and so on. There's a lot of politics.
Yes, there is a lot of politics on Uganda, but let me first explain the Russian issue. The Russian issue is because there was a war. And there's a lot of lobbying. If you notice, America was not in support of Russia. There was support of Ukraine. And they had a reason. America was ensuring that it protects its interests as a global superpower. Russia was proving that it's going to be more powerful than America because Russia was saying, I'm pulling back Ukraine to be part of me like it were in the time of Soviet Union. They were threatening their position. So yes, Uganda is being threatened, but Uganda is a small player on the globe. It is threatened, but it is playing carrot and stick. Have you noticed that all government officials have told you we are negotiating with World Bank to see that they come back to support Uganda? Have you also noticed that we sent a delegation of how many? The journalists reported about 70 people to the UN.
To the UN. 73.
71 it was, to be precise.
71, about 70-something people. We sent them to the UN during the UN convention. Do you know why we were sending that big number of people? It was to lobby. And why were we lobbying? Although government didn't come out to tell us that they were lobbying. Why were we lobbying? Because we wanted them to understand our own perspectives as a sovereign country on certain issues. So government is not necessarily sleeping. I don't think they are sleeping even on this oil thing. What I do not see them committed to is the local Ugandan citizen. They are committed to the global politics. They are committed to playing that global politics together with the key players. And that is why I was saying Total might not go. Total also wants these products. They also want to continue being a dominant company internationally in terms of selling oil and oil products. And they want to replace many of the companies that have failed to get into new markets. And if Uganda is offering an opportunity for them to get oil, then they can do. And they would actually disadvantage UNOC more or advantage it. It depends on how the organization is situated. And the bill, according to the minister, is meant to make UNOC stand out on the international market.
Mr. Joseph, she gives us confidence that Total Shell will not leave. But in any case, they leave. Does UNOC have capacity to supply fuel to Ugandans?
We don't know because evidence as before, they've shown us that in many cases, as a state, they fail the big way. But that said, of course, Charles is also right that should Total and Shell or any of these other companies decide to leave, it will not necessarily be the end of the world. It's unlikely that they would. And if anything, as far as the legislation is concerned, the proposed legislation, it does not mean, therefore, that it's the end of the game, because it does not mean, therefore, that they're not necessarily not able to participate in the lower end of the business chain. And in any case, it does not mean that they're not completely not profitable. The monopoly of control would not be an exception for Uganda. Of course, UPC, we took massive monopoly in a very strategic way in the 60s, and we were quite successful, and we continued still then to go ahead and run a big government, a big progressive left, but with a mixed economy, with a very active and a present private sector. China, does monopoly on many of these big things. In fact, I admire them. You guys, you wait. A future UPC government in which I'm involved, we will be actually leading, making sure that Ugandan companies don't only take, where the monopoly is unrealistic, take leads, meaning lead shares, primary shares, and leading on many of these other things. You can do that. China does that. Is a communist state. with their big companies that now come to trade in Uganda, but does not mean that China is still on path to be the largest economy in the world. No, it's not. Our problem is still just about whether or not we can trust the government on the best of their record in terms of their ability to deliver on the promises. And of course, therefore, if they are not able to do so, what about the checks and balances? The unlikely event that they fail, then of course your concern would be very valid. But I think all we can do now is to continue to say that, well, in principle, it's a good move. In principle, it's a welcome thing. And in my opinion, in principle, it is something which is, possibly 20 years too late. The legislation should have been, sealed as of the time of it first enacting in 2003, really, and not today, 20 years later. If anything, actually, if you consider the amount of money we've lost, the amount of opportunities we've lost, and by the way, some of these things also, they go away with jobs. These guys, some of their top skilled jobs come from abroad, and some of the skills opportunities that younger, emergent Ugandans of 20 years ago would be the top corporate directors today is huge. So the implication is actually quite huge. Let's just hope that we were to fill the gap.
You keep mentioning the competence, talking competence, and maybe Madam Charity can help us. How do we get competent people in these positions to make sure this deal is a good one?
You see, where I started and I had told you that I would explain is that Uganda still grapples with the question of corruption.
Yeah.
That we are as corrupt as even selecting the most competent people for offices. That except you're somebody's son or somebody's daughter or somebody's relative who knows someone, you do not qualify for that position, even when you're well trained and well schooled in that position. But if we had a competitiveness of where we allow Ugandans to honestly compete for jobs based on credit and based on their academic training, then we would be able to have competence. Because a person will come into office when they know what they are doing and they understand the market in which they are and the factors that play out within that market to be able to position your country for the best. But what we see more is cutthroat competition, who knows who, nepotism, those are the kinds of things that we see. So when I talk corruption and when I talk failure to manage it for the so many years, 30 years plus, it's a big issue on every industry, no matter the laws that exist. It's a big issue on every process, no matter the laws that exist. So the law might be good, it might be existent, but what are you doing in there and who have you put there?
The application and the enforcement, yes.
The interests of Uganda. I think these are issues to be considered. There are things to be thought about, even in the whole supply chain and the players within the space. We need to see more transparency and more accountability coming out from these organizations, not under carpet conversations that are happening where people cannot even access public documents when the Constitution is clear about your right to information. In Article 41 says, look, if you want information about any public process, walk to that office. You should be granted that information. So why are you denied as a Ugandan? Information to do with oil, information to do with local content, information to do with which oil companies have been listed, who are they going to trade with, even local skill artisans, because we should have had more Ugandans in the local skill artisan jobs. But who do we see? We see more Chinese. We've seen more Chinese coming to take up artisan jobs than Ugandans, which is not fair for a country that is saying this bill that we have come up with is to ensure that Ugandans get the best out of this oil.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. Competence.
Yes.
We have the anti-corruption unit, we have Uganda Police, we have the Inspectorate of Government, we have... where are we failing?
The fish rots from the top. It starts from top, starts from State House, starts from Mr. Museveni. The guy is as incompetent today as he was then, but more importantly, the guy is just tired. But that one. But number two, I think really this is what is important going forward. a system, as Charity says, in which if you say we are doing compulsory competitive tendering as a process by the state, then you know that companies will come and compete for tenders. It will be open, it will be fair, it will be sealed, and it will be precise. And that you will win either on the basis of merit or on price or other related competencies and nothing else. That is absent on the state. We talk road projects, there's this other company that is related to some of the guys in the state. We can go on there, but, let's refocus to this. You do that. Number two, we've got people who went and rushed to train in oil and gas. I meet some graduates from around the country every now and again. And many of them will tell you, quite frankly, they went for these other things. And the listing of people who are precise are people from a particular sub-county in this country. And particular names without prejudice. Part of the other thing then is that, okay, even if it's these people who come to do these jobs, what do they do? What are the regulatory frameworks which are available? How do we seriously take skilling in this country? How do we take the laws, governing, industrial relations, employment relationships? So how many times do people go for retraining? Even in particular specialist skills. It is some of those things. So basically, I told you that we are surviving as a country by accident. That's basically what I'm trying to say. No, we are not a silly nation. It is possible actually for somebody to leave senior six, an average decent person with physics and maths, and go and become a trainee and work around an industrial site, go through basic training, and after 6 months as an apprentice, have an idea. And if the environment in that workplace is one in which there is order, there's organization, there's discipline, there's structure, people get skilled. That does not exist in any industry. I don't know any indigenous industry in Uganda. You hear stories about some of the banks, the Stanbics and of this world. I'm not quite sure which genuine Ugandan organization, the successful public organization that we set up, UPC set up and still running, is the National Waters and Sewage Corporation, without prejudice. I've got friends who work down there. But you'll be told about how some of these things are still also being run around families. But simply because at the end of the day, the organization is profitable, is neither here nor there. No, I think, when we're discussing this oil thing, we just need to go back to the wider national question, that we need to return most of these big conversations about the destiny and future of our country, and that, I want to insist, younger Ugandans ought to begin to get much more interested in these things. The small prints, both in terms of the proposed legislation and the small prints behind the legislations, and the small prints in terms of what's actually happening, particularly in some of these already, you can call them Albertine areas. There's so many things which are going on. And as I say today, I'm not really here to try and pick too many of these other things because, to be fair, we want to stick to this. In principle, the proposal is okay, is long overdue. We are just concerned that because of the manner in which things actually operate in this country, we are not quite sure whether we will be able to deliver on that as a state. But because we are talking the future and we're very optimistic people, Chat and I, we want to hope that this time around, you guys, while you scrutinize and put the state on the defensive, they're able to be much more clearer, and whoever then takes over these organizations, they take it over on behalf of and in the interest of the young citizens of this country.
Well, thank you, Mr. Joseph. Thank you, Madam Charity. We're heading into the first half of this show, and it's really interesting. You can hear how the two people on the show are not really sure whether government will manage this very well, but later in the show we discuss how the environment is going to be catered for, but also who manages this money. We see these people do not trust government. Who should we trust as Ugandans? Let's go for a short break and we'll return.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media, or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
Welcome back from that short break. It's still Focus on Parliament on Civic Space TV, and I'm Philip Muliisa. And earlier in the conversation, we talked about competence and corruption and who is managing the oil and the signing of the agreements. But briefly, I want us to talk about one of the aims of the proposed bill is for UNOC to make money from oil. UNOC wants to make money, and I assume this money is for government. Is government going into business? And where does this money go?
As I said, I'm a socialist. I do not. I actually fundamentally believe that there are certain elements for public organizations that I don't mind the states, having control, if not bigger voice in terms of regulations. But that also means that I believe, in a system in which there is an active role of the state, side by side with industry. This one sounds rather sweeping, actually, because part of the worrying thing is that it appears you simply say that, well, nobody, no private entity is going to be allowed, and Charity clarified on that, would be allowed to engage in the process. If it is as the sole importer, I don't know how many private companies in China, private individual business companies in China have got the right to for instance, import or possibly export petroleum products formally. But, in other countries, again, where it's not like that, there are statutory regulatory bodies, that help to, if you like, mitigate what would others be some of the challenges. In Uganda, we don't. So as far as this is concerned, I would have no problem. So in terms of making profit, government, do they make profit? Is it framed like that? No. Government basically goes to, because the money is our pocket, our money. If they go ahead and purchase these, and they go ahead and purchase them from the most competitive sources, the amount of money that remains is not profit. The amount of money that remains is equivalent to the money that remains in our exchequer, and then we're able to decide whether or not those are monies which are ring fenced to energy or industry or transportation, or money that goes into very urgently, badly needed in the sectors like health and education, and that would be no problem. If you consider that our Minister for Finance, and there's a minister from the oil zone of Albertine region next to Hoima, is also Minister of Mabati, meaning thieving, I have no confidence, from that point of view. And that's why I was saying, I've been saying continuously that the young Ugandans ought to be more interested in this debate. And I'm delighted that you, as the presenter, you're young, and the camera persons, are young people. And Charity is equally fantastically young. But actually, like Charity says, no, we need to participate in this. Ugandans need to be able to participate in this conversation. But problem is that, yes, we do not trust the state from its history. Were we emphasizing beyond corruption as a sweeping thing, the competence and capacity of the state to necessarily be able to do these things? In part, unfortunately, yes, we are. And in fact, actually, very interestingly, normally the right-wing guys, or perhaps people who don't like the state participating in businesses, the argument is usually that public organizations tend to be inefficient and incompetent because there is insufficient drive or motivation for them to do so. I believe that that is to an extent only true, but actually the health service organization which is most efficient and most popular in the world is the British National Health Service, for which we buy, and that is a public organization. And although the Conservatives have always continued to try and break it and break it and break it for profit, by and large it remains the most admirable health service in the world. So it's actually possible for a statutory organization, once the citizens buy into it, because in Britain, touch their NHS, National Health Service, then you lose votes. Have a perception that you're touching their National Health Services, you lose votes. And so it is possible for us to go through this, except that government realizes that, well, if they do not account properly for these oil monies, if they don't run this properly, and if there is openness as far as the management and the running of these organizations are concerned, then it will not be a problem. But then brings us back to the fact that there's a Mangosha case which is still pending, and these guys have stubbornly refused to move an inch. That would worry me, and that there's no reason why. If that would worry me and it's worrying me, it would not worry me that, well, maybe this might be another opportunity for some persons interested in actually siphoning the profits on behalf of the government, in the name of government, but the profit that some other private companies were taking. So just quickly, though, to conclude, if you see the discussion around the car registration thing, how the contracting conversation went.
Digital number
Yes,
plates.
digital number plates. And you see that it was a conflict that was nearly, it turned out into a conflict between two personalities, and these are two historical NRA ministers. It tells you really what can easily come out of this. I hope it doesn't happen here.
Yes, Madam Charity. When you go to Russia and you talk anything oil and gas, it is either Gazprom or Novatek. When you go to Europe, you're either talking about Total, you're talking about Shell. Go to the America, you're talking ExxonMobil. Is it about time the Uganda government set up a company specifically for itself to undertake oil activity?
Wow. Would the international community allow for such a company to exist, for it to take its own interests? I think you raise a good point, because you see, when you look at the American market and when you look at the British market, for them, they look out for their interest, number one, and to see what do we maximize out of this. They don't even have oil wells themselves. Their resources are depleted, but they're very brilliant in strategizing and strategically positioning themselves. And I think, just to stick with you a bit with, can we trust our money in the central fund? We have seen how money goes into the central fund, and we know that a law exists on how money should be spent from the central fund. But is it true that we follow the law to the letter in terms of how that money is spent from the central fund? No, we don't. We have supplementary budgets as and when we want, and we spend on things that are not as useful to a country as it would be for America, as it would be for UK when they were setting up those oil companies that they set up, because they invested in them. They put aside money from their government shoppers to set up those companies and to cause them to go to trade internationally. And they spent time investing in who functions within those companies. And that is why they are now big brands, they're big names, because they have systems that they established and they had the backing of their country to go and do the trading. So if Uganda was organized to a level of, we know the grand picture is for us to make money for ourselves as a country, and that this money will help us eventually do the things Joseph was talking about: education, schools, roads, infrastructure. If that is the agenda, because you see, at the place where we sit, World Bank is saying, we're not giving you money. And of course, IMF will also soon say, no, we can't also give you money. And we saw Norway packing their bags and leaving and saying, okay, but we shall continue to support Uganda from a distance. We shall see more embassies. We also saw North Korea leaving Uganda. And there are many, many other people that might want to leave. Every time you see an embassy folding, then it means that the relationship is being strained. The more you see those embassies opening and having camp within a country, then the more open that country is to even their economies. So if you want to set up a useful company that is going to become an international brand, one of the things that you need to do then is to open new, what would we say, partnerships with trusted organizations, set up good systems, also buffer those companies with finances from the government chauffeurs, but done according to the law. Cut down on budgets that have been spent on useless things, and instead invest in this one organization which you know will make money for Uganda in terms of the oil that you want to produce in 2025. Then that makes a lot of sense.
Wow, Mr. Joseph, she mentions how we spend our money from the central facility. And over time, people ask, for example, you have members of parliament, over 500. We buy cars for these individuals. We pay them a good salary. Ministers, a good salary. We buy them cars. Is it worth spending this money?
We even transport leaders of opposition from aircraft to their homes for free.
That's conversation for that. But what do you have to say about how we spend the money from our national coffers?
No, that is normally a matter for fiscal. Those are fiscal agenda for any governing political organization, fiscal and money and taxation policies, and all for respective governments, and in this case, governing political parties. But like I said, in this country, we have an NRM that is not a governing political party, but it's a governing political organization ruling for themselves. Because, as I said, genuinely, these guys will normally talk about manifestos, but you realize that times leading to campaigns, we rarely have major debates about our spends. Budgets are rarely discussed. We never rarely subject ourselves, competing political parties and organizations.
And the question of accountability is not respected.
Yes, and then
transparency, accountability is not respected.
And you know why and the reason, those are actually the point I'm trying to say, that actually we have a system which is very entrenched, where there is an apparent impunity. So
because Joseph, let me give you information. We have had oil coming from Muliisa, Hoima, and the regions over a period of time now. Crude oil, not the actual oil that is meant to go into the pipeline. But in terms of accountability, where has the money gone, and how much has been produced from there, and how much has been traded? We should be seeing that on places like stock exchange. We should be seeing it in documents and running around with it to do proper accountability and transparency of the money and the balance sheet. How much has Uganda been able to make out of the crude oil, and how can we make it better? That is what should be happening. That's what happened with the American companies that you were quoting, with the British companies, because there must be that transparency. It might not be 100%. And because I know now from working with the British and Americans that even them, they could put out a reflection which is not necessarily true. But even if it is not necessarily 100% true, they attempt to do it. So we need accountability for how much have we produced so far, what is it that we were selling in the first place, and how much went into the central facility, our central fund. We need that statistic to be able to know and project that, okay, from 2025, once Uganda begins to produce oil, we'll be able to produce we'll be able to sell products and make about maybe 20 billion or 15 billion or 150 billion. And from that estimate, then hold government accountable. But we have no idea. We're just dripping in the dark. The moment that happens, then it goes to tell you that even if you have a monopoly called Uganda National Oil Company, all these issues are still going to be reproduced in that company.
And to an extent that, as I said, thank you. And to the extent that, as I said, that if we were to do that, ministries, say, of national guidance, and indeed Ministry for Industry, in this case, possibly energy in this case, because of the excitement about oil, if you actually were to engage your nation, actually it's politically to the advantage of the ruling authorities to get excitement from the citizens, meaning if they're genuine. But that's what the point I was trying to say, that, well, these guys don't live and survive on the mandate of the people, so they really don't care. In part because of rigging themselves as a process, but two, because of the manner in which they come, which is still quite unfortunate. But these are things that would have happened that, look, Minister of National Guidance say that, oh, we've done this, so we've got already a ton of it gets feel good factor really on the citizen. We now have this, so there's hope. So don't you worry. Even if 10 Mabati have gone, don't worry. Things are coming. Now the oil that we got the other day. Now the conversation about AGOA, which happened, I think 2 days ago, I was on television with the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the guy was busy dismissing the AGOA thing. But yes, it might be a small thing, still related to trade. Might be a small thing, but one, the impression and the image it gives to our country is one. But number two, there are small companies and businesses, that are going to lose out from the subsidies that would others get in terms of tax exemption in exporting to the US. And then number three, if you invested so much, which they did over 20 years ago, onto this AGOA thing, and then you encourage people to go ahead and do and set up themselves with the hope that they're actually going to get tax incentives in the tax incentives in the US, and all of a sudden it's bang. You don't begin to grandstand, don't you worry. And part of that grandstanding, you don't even say that, okay, we understand the US have taken their position. We don't agree with them. Whatever happens is regrettable. But you, our fellow citizens, who have been impacted and who are going to be impacted, one, as ordinary consumers and perhaps including employees, but two, you as small companies that were exporting to America, this is how we're going to support you.
Perhaps the government
But
is super
the
excited
president
about...
responded. He actually did not just thump saying this time around that take your money or AGOA or whatever. No. He actually said America was wrong to take such a decision. He tried to explain how, as a country, we were benefiting from the relationship between us and the United States in the AGOA. And he even said he hopes they'll be able to have negotiations that return Uganda into that AGOA trade deal. He did. He did not just stamp.
Clearly, he's minister for.
He should fire him.
Really, he is his son's babysitter. That's my OB Okello Oriem, who I was with him on a television program, and so was the same publication Chris Baromosi talking about it, that Uganda will not be blackmailed, and taking a very, very unfortunate direction with this. But no, we have every reason to be concerned that on the basis of track record and history, is unlikely that we can guarantee that the two of us can come here and promise and guarantee Ugandans that a new phase is coming in the next 1 year, where you'll be all around surrounded by nothing yet but oil and oily food and dollars to pick.
I want to expand that conversation about trade to the African continent. Maybe those ministers are looking at AGOA and a developing African continental free trade area, then East African community, and they think what was going to the United States is coming to East Africa, to the African market. But also, how can it be that the whole of Africa cannot have a refinery, cannot have a standing oil company that can come and explore the Albertine region?
We started from there, didn't we? We started from there in our conversation. That's why we're talking East Africa. I actually genuinely believe that if this is in this season, we had our founding parents, particularly the Obotes and the Nyeros of this world, in the sub-region, now we would be having a very different East Africa, I can tell you that. Meaning, therefore, that perhaps it would not be surprising that actually the companies that would be doing even the original lead in the exploration would have been either East African, or they would just have hired technocrats to come and maybe pay a few of them with our top engineers leading on this. No, we don't.
Mr. Joseph, you keep talking about the Obotes of this world, but Mwalimu Nyerere is quoted to have said that he wanted the East African countries to get independence at once, such that it can be one country on independence. And Obote and Kenyatta of Kenya are the people that oppose that idea. So
No, that's actually not true, because remember, if anything, Uganda became independent before Tanzania. I know where you get some of those things. Some of these people go ahead and sometimes want to plant a few saints here and there. No, we do not want. When I refer to this, I do not want to make political points, nor do I want to promote my vote and my UPC. I am definitely trying to tell you guys that at the founding of these nation states, and I know, at the founding of these nation states, there were ever men.
No,
and
I'm happy with Muliisa.
there were ever men and women. I know you are. There are ever
Yes,
men and women.
He makes a good point.
Yes, there are ever men and women in this country who had the vision and built the foundations, and it worked. That's basically my point. Number two, my point is absolutely this, that actually the current leaders have failed you. And my number three, why I invoke that, is to give you guys hope that if these guys did those things 60 years ago, 50 years ago, there's no reason why out of this conversation, with your pressure onto people who are, who are holding politics hostage and ideas and brain thinking hostage, there's no reason why you guys, we don't emerge out of these things in a manner in which we're able to do that one Africa thing that we're talking about. If anything, anyway, Mr. Museveni is a believer in Pan-Africanism, but he sings this sometimes in that very not particularly singing voice of his. So he sings integration. Where's the evidence? So how comes they failed on the what Chat was referring to? That's why I was invoking that. I'm simply saying our founding parents, had the view, had the thought, they started a community and it functioned, including a currency thing. 50 years later, we're doing so badly. So yes, unfortunately, while we're doing this so badly within the region, it is even much more complicated doing it at a continental level. In fact, at a continental level, again, 60 years ago, you could feel our leaders, you could feel Obote's phone call with the Nkrumah impacting the continent and shaking America. Today, who? That's what I'm trying to say. So in other words, no, unfortunately, is the quality of leadership that we have today. It's also about the quality of politics that we have today. But you're absolutely right. We basically need to revisit that and make sure that there's one voice. I was giving a television interview in response to AGOA to a Southern African network the other day. And this is one of the things I was actually trying to invoke. It is urgent that while discussions took place in South Africa the other day on AGOA and others, that African leaders, when we're having these conversations, and because part of the thing I was being asked was this thing about the US stance on this. I'm simply saying that no, this should be wake-up calls for African leaders, that while we're discussing in Uganda how we should manage whatever is happening in Muliisa, this is time for African leaders to sort out their houses, to put their houses in order, and create possibilities. You're absolutely right, for our engineers and technologists, to be able to work towards the direction in which we don't need a Chinese guy to dig a borehole down in Chisasi and Nigeria.
Mr.
And one
Joseph,
of the very irritating,
the UPC government would not have allowed Chinese companies, American
No.
companies to have come into this economy to do some of this.
No. I'm not saying that, but certainly not to do what they've done and what they're doing today. Certainly not. Not to get a Chinese man, digging a drain. Certainly, a Chinese man digging a drain, and there are 20 supervising people around him, young people like yourselves. So, a Chinese man digging a drain in Kampala. Let me tell you this. One of the earliest, and it's important conversation, one of the earliest disagreements UPC had with the West, including, ironically, actually with Israel, was a 1968 position. I don't know whether it was legislative or whether it was just a policy position, where the government said that, well, major foreign companies that invest, and of course then we're then big on construction, the industry and others, that it was wrong for people to bring a plane load of them, they're mainly men, and only come and find Ugandans who are basically going to roll wheelbarrows. And that was the case, therefore, that if you are coming as a project director, I'm afraid your deputy is going to be Ugandan. And if you're coming as a technocrat, that's why I invoked that there's no reason why you do not have a Ugandan director, even after 60 years, a Ugandan project director on this oil thing, a project lead, with maybe a technical person who comes maybe from Total in France, but comes as a technical advisor to support you. That really is what should be happening. And yes, a UPC government of the time of today would happen. And evidence is this, that we've had functioning industries, functioning systems, functioning railways. Museveni actually in 1988 boasted that, the guy told a lie actually, that, he's got a new engineering line that is started from Kasese, that these things are going to stop. Now, I don't know what happened.
You see, Mr. Joseph, in this era of globalization, you have Chinese constructing in the United States, you have Americans doing construction in Russia, you have Europeans doing construction in Africa.
I get you very well, and it's for the purpose of time. I get you very well. I get you very, very well. I am not saying, and it will be a contradiction anyway, we are here to say, in principle, this is a good thing. We are not saying there that a Ugandan company fit and capable of doing this means that Uganda is a monopoly that blocks the rest of other countries participating. No, we are simply saying that we want Uganda independently. You know what? We started the Uganda Commercial Bank. I had a discussion, and normally use that as an example. We started Uganda Commercial Bank as an indigenous bank. And one of the reasons why we founded Uganda Commercial Bank was at the time because we knew that at the time the Barclays of this world were ripping off Ugandans, Standard Chartered and many of these ripping off Ugandans here. You know, we started off Uganda Commercial Bank. Do you know what? This NRA guy sold Uganda Commercial Bank for a penny. Right now, do you know the banks in Uganda? There is no indigenous bank, even Centenary. Apparently now it has lost the majority shares. And then I meet somebody from Kenya Commercial Bank, and you know what the NRA guy said? Oh, market, oh, competition and things like this, good. No, there is a way in which you do the balance. And that's all I'm trying to say.
Yes, thank you. Madam Charity, you see Mr. Joseph here keeps bringing in the politics. And we want to discuss this politics, the quality of leadership we have in this country. And you can take it from the presidency, take it to the ministerial positions, take it to members of parliament, councillors, chairpersons, LC5. And how would you assess the quality of leadership we have in this country, and where do we go after here?
The quality of leadership. I think we have big leadership gaps and big governance gaps in Uganda. And when I talk about big leadership and governance gaps, is that everybody assigned to do a job within a particular place will sometimes find themselves inhibited by the technocrats, or the technocrats will find themselves inhibited by the leadership. And then there is a clash between the leader of a ministry and the technocrats. And ideally, in a seamless government or in a seamless system, the technocrats and the politicians should not conflict, because the technocrats have the thrust of what it is the ministry or the issue is, because they have done research, they've been in these offices for 20 years, they are hardly shifted around, but the politicians come and go. So the technocrats should be the guiding principles in terms of interventions that the politicians come to achieve. But that doesn't happen in Uganda. Instead, what we see is conflict, that the technocrats, that the politicians try to assert themselves even more than the technocrats would. Ideally, a politician should sit back and learn from the technocrats, because the technocrats know what has happened in that office or what has happened in that system. So what we have is what your friend said, system volongoto, in his song. That is what we have, that the system is upside down. Other than listen to each other and learn from each other in order to have good governance and good management within our systems, we compete to outshine each other, especially if we are politicians, that the appointing authority will take note of us and give us more mandate, or shift us to a better ministry, or give us more money. So we are money-driven, we are personal agenda-driven, and we are not nationalistic in our thinking. Had we been more deliberate in being nationalistic, and being deliberate on being nationalistic does not only come from the president. It also doesn't only come from the leaders themselves. It is a whole grand system that builds one onto another. One of the things I have found politicians telling me is that even when you mean well, you sometimes get into a place and you're frustrated by the system. But who is the system? It is still the people who are manning within that system. Supposing everybody woke up one morning and said, for me, I will not be corrupt. They walk into their office and they say, we will not crack a corruption deal today. Let the man who leads the deals or the dealers or whatever it is, or who cracks the biggest deal with whoever he wants to deal with. But they wake up and decide that for them, they are meticulous, they're not going to do it. If they will be sacked, they are sacked.
You know, there is a concept in political science that says nostalgia does not mean that things were better in the past, but certainly because things have gone wrong in the present. Do you think the kind of leaders we had in the past, and in the past I want to emphasize the post-independence times, 1960 and 70, and the leaders we have today, do you think the leaders then were better than the leaders we have today?
The breed of leaders that we had then, were they better than the leaders we have today? I think they are similar in very many ways. The ones of the past had influences of the times, because you also have to contextualize what was happening at that time. At that time, different countries were getting independence. At that time, different countries were beginning to set up governments and have institutions put in place. They're beginning to have parliaments, they're beginning to have courts, they're beginning to have grand norms, the constitution established. So that, in that context, even Uganda found itself having leaders who were aspiring to do the things they were seeing other countries doing. Fast forward into the 21st century, what is happening globally and what is happening contextually within the region? So when you look at Tanzania, what is exactly happening in Tanzania? Tanzania is also getting into a phase of, they organized themselves at the time of Nyerere. And the influence of Nyerere still lives to date. We did not get a chance to have somebody who organized us to the standard of Nyerere. Even Obote had a chance to have done that, because he had Obote 1 and he had Obote 2. But I'm sure Joseph has very good explanations as to why he did not manage. But had he organized us and took a firm stand, because, I mean, he was head of state at that time, and organized us, probably President Museveni would have come and fit in the jigsaw, and we would be moving according to the standards that he had set. So now, okay, fast forward. We get President Museveni, and when he comes, he starts from a very good place. He starts by doing constitutionalism, by establishing a grand norm. That took a period of time. Remember, there was a constituent assembly, there was consultation, there was picking views, and then setting up of a government. And then taking away the decrees, which he was ruling by, because the decrees were a reminder of Amin. Amin had ruled by decrees, so he had to get rid of the decrees, and then we have a constitution moving, and then start to live according to the constitution. It's not also true that leaders can be homogeneous. I think part of the problem we have had is for us to compromise. Every leader that has come, the new breed of leaders, there's been a lot of compromise. That every man has a price. We became Sir Richard Rich in Robert Bolt. Robert Bolt, when he wrote that book, he was saying in A Man for All Seasons, I don't know if you've read it, Robert, this one should have read it. The whole idea of that character, who was called Sir Richard Rich, was that every man has a price. You just name my price and I'm gone. But if our leaders understood that it's not about the price, but it is about nationalism, then it would be a bit different. Because then you're not thinking about my ultimate benefit, but you're thinking about the ultimate benefit which will help you, your children, and your grandchildren. Because if I don't talk about the poor education system, if I don't talk about the poor health system in Uganda, one day I will end up in that hospital. And it doesn't matter whether I'm NRM, I'm DP, I'm FDC, I will still access the same services. And I will still be treated the same way. And I will need a certain amount of money to pay for that service. As long as I understand that, then when I embrace leadership, I should have that as my perspective. Unfortunately, what happens is that everybody has eaten, everybody has earned. So when I go there, I should also eat, I should earn, and go home and keep quiet.
You see, continuously they say the leadership of a country, a particular region, is a clear reflection of its peoples. Is that true of the people of Uganda, of Kenya, of East Africa, and Africa as a whole?
I think it is a true reflection of the people, because if you look at Tanzanians, they're a bit laid back. And that laid back strategy was a strategy that was initiated by Julius Nyerere. He had a reason why he caused a laid back strategy for his country. Two things he did. He caused them to lay back by learning Kiswahili on a gunpoint. Now, in his view, learning Kiswahili was a homogeneous language which was meant to unite them. That they will not think about themselves in terms of tribes like in Uganda it is. And for us, it is a true reflection, isn't it? That if you don't come from Buganda, then I don't like you. If you don't come from Western Uganda, those ones, they are proud, they are this, they are that, they have a whole set of things about them. You come from Eastern Uganda, Jigas, it is this. You know, there is a branding, there is something. You come from Northern Uganda, these ones, they know English, but that's all they do. They know just English. The other time they were in the war, they know how to fight. They are warriors, they are hunters. So we have faceted ourselves and become tribalistic and spent all our years playing tribal politics, ethnicity politics, and hatred politics. While the laid-back people spoke one language, they didn't think of themselves as coming from particular regions. I look at Joseph as my brother, and it doesn't matter what Joseph gets. I'm happy that he got it.
Thank you.
But what happens now is, except you come from my region, I'm not happy that you have it. I must fight you and pull you down. Then Uganda continues to move in a cycle of poverty. It continues to move in a cycle of hopelessness. It continues to move in a cycle of big pot-bellied men and leaders who think about only their interests other than national interests.
Yes, thank you. Honorable Joseph, I see that conversation excites you, but
yes, I'm checking it.
over time we talk about, yes, the Museveni government has failed us, and you like
Fundamentally,
saying
yes.
he's not a politician, he doesn't have the values and so on. But one morning...
Philip, sorry, you're asking Joseph a very good question, but I wanted to interject and bring Rwanda, because you asked me East Africa.
That was good.
So when Paul Kagame took over Rwanda, it was at a certain point. There are certain things Paul has decided to do for that country at whatever cost. Whether he's called a dictator, whether he's called one who wants to stay in that chair forever, and he has done them. Has he achieved them finally? He has, at a very high cost of some Rwandese dying and what, and maybe now he needs to think more of being humane. And I think that's where the problem started with Uganda. The president is said to be more humane than taking more hard stance. That is what...
Maybe at that exact point I need to ask you, there is always a conversation about leadership, the leadership systems, and we talk democracy and human rights and elections and the rule of law. Do you think at some points countries like Uganda need a leader like Paul Kagame who can use a strong hand to streamline some of the factors in the country? And
I agree. Not that they need to take away human rights, because those are inherent from all the scholars that we know. They are inherent, and I think that President Kagame for failing on that ground is not good. He needs to improve on his human rights respect. But in terms of being a shrewd leader who has delivered roads of a certain quality, who has delivered pathways, the man has now put pathways for them in Kigali, suddenly looking like our Kololo in the times of UPC and Joseph. But that time of UPC and Joseph, there were fewer people in Kampala. Now we have 4 million people. But we can't use that argument as well, because in Rwanda, they have a similar number of population, but they have the roads, they have the trees, they have the well-planned path, they have their environmental concerns. You throw a polythene bag, Kagame will lock you up for years, and he doesn't care that you're locked up. We need a bit of that. We need carrot and stick for some things if they will benefit us all. But for you to use carrot and stick, when it's going to benefit just a few people in power and those who have guns, is where we have gone wrong as Uganda.
Thank you. And I want to pick your opinion on that exact subject, Mr. Joseph. Do you think a country like Uganda needs a leader who is hard body to streamline some of the aspects of this country?
It would be unfair for me to start with that question, and it would be unfair for me not to make reference to your early questions to Charity, especially because that's an area where I fundamentally disagree with her in terms of the leaders of the past versus the leaders of the present.
Please.
And not because I am stuck on the leaders of the past after all. I'm a leader of the present. Many people say that, but because I'm stuck to their values, and I'm completely convinced that these are the values that we need to be able to re-impart on the present, even if it meant doing it the Kagame way. I reject, and I was trying to check out how many countries were independent on the African continent in 1962. They were definitely less than 1/3 of what we have today as a continent. And so we had fewer, and including therefore fewer references. So I think it would be unfair, and for us as Uganda, so it would be unfair for us almost to judge the mess by NRA, since we're talking Uganda specifically, to judge it on the basis of the foundations the NRA found. If anything, actually, on every facet, I'm delighted that even security, NRA now loses to UPC. Even on national security, NRA thankfully now loses to UPC. So, and then if you consider some of the issues that were being raised about these things about national unity, public services, on the question of national unity, Obote 1 and Obote 2, and really by the time Museveni came, this country by and large got fragmented, by and large got fragmented under Museveni. And so many of the things that have happened, Museveni dismantled most of it. On the question of language, and I think I'll make it very brief because I don't think we don't have time. On the question of language, for example, Charity, you don't know that Obote was actually blamed for wanting to impose Swahili, which is allegedly the language of the illiterates, spoken in the Kosa and Tanzania, in the early 60s and even part of the 80s. And it was a very hostile response, particularly without prejudice, by people from Central Uganda and the West, that Swahili is a language for soldiers and this is a language for northerners. So there have been many things that have actually happened. And
but is it because the soldiers were doing certain things to citizens?
That would be unfortunate, and it would be almost rather, no, it's very important, it would be rather simplistic, because if you consider what the soldiers of Obote time did with what the soldiers of Museveni's time have done, the soldiers of Museveni's time have committed far much more atrocities than the soldiers of Idi Amin's time. So even that one doesn't err. But really, because your original question, I'll make it very brief, your original question was whether or not the leaders of then and versus today. I genuinely don't know what has happened to the continent today, to the extent that, well, there's much more technological advancement, there's much more people who are much more exposed, much more educated, there are many more other countries to learn from, like Chat was saying, including in oil sector, going to Norway of this world, the Nigerians of this world. I just genuinely do not know. The African Union is a big club organization. But those founding leaders, some of them, what was the motivation? So what was this motivation that drove these guys that cannot move these people? I suggest very strongly this politics of ideology, politics of values that drove those people. These people were nationalists, these people were conscious, some of them came with a leftist view, a rightist view. They believed in a certain world view of society. And I really genuinely want to instill this on the minds and hearts of the young Ugandans, that the more we're able to do this polity, the more perhaps we're able to see that Charity and I have a lot more in common, on the basis of the values that we share, than the perception that sometimes are basically necessarily tribalistic, as it were. In Uganda, Museveni got a job in Obote's office in 1970. Nobody knew Museveni in Obote's office. The person who gave Museveni a job was a Musamia guy who was the head of research in President's office. Museveni had just graduated and he was looking for a job in the civil service like anybody else. So these things, we need to give more credit to systems that in place and some of the leaders at the time. Today, it cannot be blamed on this. And finally, on the constitutional thing, Museveni came over through the constitution. Museveni came by force of arms. Museveni came and took 10 years. We had to force him to open up. So to give credit to these guys to say that, they tried at the beginning. No, Museveni was hoodwinking people. Museveni is now an exposed guy. And the sooner he actually leaves and there's a new conversation about how to reunite our country and reheal it for the future, the better.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. And in a minute, let me get your final remarks on the show, more so on the bill and how you see.
I think on the base of this conversation, I just want to really take this conversation away from ourselves, and possibly even away from Parliament. But I mean, I hope parliamentarians listen and watch this so that they help us with this conversation. This is a conversation that actually should go as a part of a public national debate in terms of what happens. In the event that actually this is a genuine organization that is being designed as a national monopoly on our behalf, we really hope again that the citizens take much more interest in trying to ensure that, well, whatever happens, there are no underhands and there are no self-privileges, but whatever the case, that Uganda is able to genuinely benefit, from this as a country more than sort of we've done before. It is possible for us to do so, but it will only be done so when there is openness and when there is transparency and when there is an absence of impunity, and yes, when we kill corruption. That's a hard find, but it's possible.
Thank you. And Madam Charity, in a minute, do you think our members of Parliament, the ones will do due diligence in passing this bill and seeing that it is one that is in the best interest of Ugandans?
So, like Joseph is saying, and I want to agree on that one, they need to think about carefully the issue of systems, the issue of corruption and getting rid of corruption within the system. And they also need to think about beyond the bill. How are the relationships going to benefit Ugandans at a local level, but international level? They cause the linkages, what we call the backward and forward linkages in terms of oil and the oil sector to buffer Ugandans. So they've made a promise, and for us as citizens, we shall hold government accountable on the promise they've made to ensure that our pump price comes down, it is regulated better, our reservoirs don't run dry, because we now have a 312 million liter facility that can ensure we are buffered even in times of scarcity. So when there is scarcity, when there is war, when there is all these things happening, you can be assured we shall hold you accountable.
Yes, the Honorable Joseph Ochieno and Council Charity Ahimbisibwe, thank you so much for joining us today. And to you, our viewer, thank you so much for being with us all this time. It's this week's edition of Focus on Parliament on Civic Space TV. I have been Philip Muliisa. A big thanks to the people behind the cameras, Pal, the internet lady, Mr. Rashid, and special thanks to Center for Constitutional Governance for the work you do and for making sure this is possible.